Well, we're starting to get a lot of folks on the call, and so I wanted to kind of get us going so we're not too late getting started. I'm Victoria Cobb, president of the Family Foundation. Sorry, my picture's a little grainy today, but I won't be the main one speaking, so I don't think we'll be too worried about that. Thanks to many of you who joined us last week and are back this week. Last week, we had a great conversation with Delegate Dave LaRock. We talked a lot about just the moment that we're in and what that means for government, and specifically a lot of recommendations that he had for our governor with regards to what to do with the budget. The governor's done a little bit. I think there's a feeling there could be a lot more done. I suspect we'll hear a little bit from Senator Newman today about what that would look like if the governor took really aggressive actions with regards to spending. But at this point, we're kind of just 1 week shy of veto session. That happens next Wednesday, April 22nd. That's when all the legislators go back in to address what the governor has done with bills that he maybe would have amended or vetoed. It's their job to then either accept the amendments or override a veto or whatever they choose to do. So it's kind of a big moment this week as we think about what that looks like next week, in particular for a budget and spending measures. And many of you who followed session understand that there was I would argue an environment this year very different than last year for matters of businesses. And so it's very interesting that we're coming into this tough economic time right after this General Assembly session. A favorable way to say this session was that it was very pro-employee. The way we would say it was a very anti-business session. A lot of legislation came out that actually really does hit the bottom line of businesses. And that's everything from minimum wage increases to things like a whole lot of opportunities for employees to sue their employer. Some of those specifically that we're concerned about that get to issues of religious freedom, because they impact churches and schools and not just traditional businesses, and also just things, sort of collective bargaining and how that would impact businesses. So there's a lot here that really should be on the table right now in this moment when the economy is not what it needs to be given the pandemic. And so we talked a little bit about that last week, and really appreciate Delegate LaRock's joining us. I want to just mention, if you're just kind of checking in, the governor's deadline to address bills was Saturday at midnight. And unfortunately, a lot of the legislation we were really praying over and acting and being engaged with the governor on, asking him to either strike in its entirety or at least amend. Unfortunately, he signed without touching a lot of bills that are just horrible for the things that the family values that you and I share on life and marriage and religious freedom. So I'll just run over those couple of things so that you're in the know. And then we're going to shift over in just a minute to the whole reason you're probably here is to hear Senator Newman's take on it. So just to mention a couple of bills that we were kind of laser focused on. One was the abortion repeal bill. And essentially what it did is it took all of the laws that we have put in place in the last 40 plus years, starting in 1975, all the way until just recently with things like safety standards for abortion centers and ultrasound availability for women to see what their ultrasound looks like and what that unborn child, what the stage of that unborn child is in, and just those important things, all the way back to 1975's law that says only physicians are going to do abortion. This law overrode all of that and struck out all of those good common sense laws. And so we were hoping he would consider putting back some basic elements. He did not. We weren't surprised, but we were acting and praying and being faithful about our part in it, but he did not make any amendments there. And then the other part is the religious freedom bills, where these bills were terrible non-discrimination bills we were trying to add religious freedom amendments to. And so essentially they widened the categories of non-discrimination to include sexual orientation and gender identity, both very vague, undefined terms in many cases, and it impacts things like public accommodation. But unfortunately, the definition of public accommodation, as you recall, was so broad that it wasn't simply businesses that you would expect in that category, like retail or restaurants. It was actually any kind of church, school, really anything that could possibly be open to the public or allowed anyone to be a part of. And so dramatic impact there with those bills being so comprehensive in who they included. We were hoping for an amendment. He signed them as is, We fully expect there will be litigation. In fact, we'll probably be a part of the litigation, I suspect, in come July 1 when those bills do go into effect. We're gearing up now, preparing for the myriad of victims, Christian schools, churches who aren't allowed to hire according to the tenets of their faith now because of these bills. So anyway, I wanted to just kind of give you that quick update on where we are. And many of you are watching the religious freedom issues around the country and in Virginia as we have this shelter in place order, and churches are being told not to hold traditional services. So we're watching those very carefully. It's a very, very tough thing because governors are given a lot of latitude. However, the length of time our governor has chosen to shut down the state is so long, it's really a question mark on how much he can really impose these kind of things for this length of time on churches in particular. We are going to host a call for pastors. We'll be announcing that soon. It'll be next week sometime is our expectation for pastors to talk with our attorneys about what they can't do, how to work through this. Certainly, we don't want to see situations like we saw. There was one in Chincoteague not so long ago, last weekend, not Easter weekend, the weekend before that. So anyway, we're watching that very carefully as well. Just wanted to keep you in the loop. We're also engaged, just to do a quick warm-up reminder on the fact that the Attorney General is trying to take advantage of this moment. He has asked the U.S. government in a letter to reduce restrictions so that we can have telemed abortion, basically a pill sent straight to someone's home. And we have essentially alerted you all to that fact. And thankfully, I don't think this administration will concede that, but it's a concern. He has also asked the administration if they would simply consider lifting restrictions on research. As you know, we don't do embryonic stem cell research and some other things on new lines, but this Attorney General is asking for that permission. Again, we've sent a letter back. We're putting pressure to not have them cave on that as well. But we just know pro-abortion legislators are going to take advantage of these moments to expand their reach. So with that, I think we should get to the heart of why we're here today. So I'm going to introduce both Todd Gackey, who is our head of our legislative relations, our government relations department, and then I'm going to also bring on Senator Steve Newman at the same time, and look forward to having him be a part of this for some questions and answers, and he can keep us up to date. Senator Newman has been a great friend to the Family Foundation and to all the things that we agree on. And in this particular session, those who stood strong on our issues have had to really sort of lead the cause verbally for so many things that we care about against a very large majority in the General Assembly who really just simply don't understand things like religious freedom. So thank you for your efforts. Thank you for joining us at the March for Life. And I'll let Todd take over here and step out of the way.
Yes, well, thank you so much for being here, Senator Newman. This is a great privilege and a pleasure to speak with you. I just wanted to first just ask how you're doing and how are you managing through this challenging time?
Well, thank you for asking. We're well. The family's well. We're preparing for a drive-in wedding soon with my oldest son, so we're doing well there. It's great to see you and Victoria, and thank you for all you're doing for those of faith and also those that cherish our families. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Well, we'll be respectful of your time, and I want to just kind of jump into some of these questions. This has been a very busy General Assembly session. This year, the new majority in the legislature passed and the governor signed a number of bills that usher in some very liberal policies: minimum wage, repealing the voter ID law, non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and rolling back decades of pro-life gains. You've been part of some changes in the General Assembly over the years. What are your general thoughts about what happened this year and the direction of the Commonwealth and its future?
Well, thank you for asking. You know, I've been now in the legislature for 29 years, and I've never seen anything like this before. We knew that the Virginia way was going to change. We were not sure it was going to change quite this much. I've got to tell you that it just seems like that those of faith were kind of in the crosshairs this year. Clearly, families were in the crosshairs, and our jobs and economic development were high on their list. I'm deeply concerned about the many anti-business bills because that hits families, right where they start their financial opportunity to make a living. And the minimum wage bills, we worked tirelessly with Democrats. We did modify that bill a little bit, but still it can be very injurious during this time. The anti-discrimination bills, a lot of people would say, that not only did they decide that they needed to add items that were of problems for those of us of faith, but then they went even further. They went even further to say that the penalties and consequential damages and all the other items they added to it set us up for some very serious lawsuits. The other is for churches. We've seen not only are they going to be involved in this anti-discrimination legislation, but you could end up with a church because they would not put in the serious language that we ask them to, that could be required to hire someone or keep someone on staff that they think is contrary to their faith. So it's a bit unfortunate we are where we are, but and it was a tough session. We were able to get a couple of victories. For the most part, though, this was a very tough year for families.
Yeah, it sure was. Let's just turn our attention a little bit to fiscal responsibility. You made some pretty prophetic remarks on the Senate about the impact of the COVID-19 would have on the state's budget and urged the Senate to be cautious. What were your thoughts at that time, and what was your recommendation to your colleagues?
Well, this was the day that we had decided to pass the budget, and I was deeply concerned. Like some in the legislature, we help run a business that employs about 800 people out of Lynchburg and San Francisco, and we were seeing dramatic impacts in that first week. My request at the time was for the legislature on the floor, pause, don't pass this budget now. This budget, in my opinion, I expressed, was going to be between $1 and $3 billion short. Some of my friends said, well, we just need to pass it because the day you pass budgets, we urge them not to do that, but they did. I think the results now that we're hearing from Secretary Aubrey Lane, who's a very noble Virginian and accurately accounting for the revenues of the Commonwealth, is we're going to be probably between $1 and $3 billion short, and that this is even in consideration with the $1.8 billion that's going to come down from the CARES Fund. My recommendation since then is we basically go back to our 2018-2020 budget, that we not have new spending, that we not have new full-time equivalent employees. We slow down government like businesses are, and we do the right thing now. The governor's put forward a couple of plans in his budget. We're still taking a look at those, but I think the right thing for us to do was to pause when we ask them to pause, make the deep cuts like families and businesses are, and treat government much more like we would our families and businesses. So we have a lot of work left to do, but we'll take a look at that sometime next week when we take up the budget.
Okay. Well, around here, we often refer to this as a bloated budget. What are some of the primary programs funded by the 2020-2022 budget that should maybe be revisited as a result of COVID-19? Are there any specific programs or items that you think should be revisited?
It's a great question, right? Because this budget, we were able, we being some of us that still serve on the money committees, to do a couple of things right. We put a lot of money into it for the rainy day fund. We put a lot of money into the revenue reserve fund that Wall Street said we needed to do to preserve our AAA bond rating. But also, if you look at the budget, it is just filled with new government positions. So you end up with a lot of new FTEs, and a lot of them are there because of these liberal programs that we had to put forward, and you have to pay for the enforcement of those programs. So if you look into the Attorney General's office, if you look into the DMV, if you look into social services, there are many of those items that we know we've got to pare back. The other is that there's been a spending spree on the welfare funding. That funding has, what we call TANF money, has been spent very liberally lately. I think there's going to be a lot of hurting Virginians right now that we need to go back to that traditional program. I would say that we wipe out all those contingency funding and go back to the core of what is that program for people who are really struggling. The last item is unemployment. Unemployment in Virginia is going to be somewhere, in my estimation, between 12 and 20%. If it hits those numbers, we're going to have to do something very serious when it comes to the funding for our unemployment compensation fund.
Great. That's some great information for everyone that's on this call. Now, Governor Northam has amended a bill, Senate Bill 971, that makes these so-called games of skill. They're like slot machines that are popping up in every convenience store and restaurants, legal in order to regulate and tax them for 1 year to use the funds to help with COVID-19 treatments and prevention efforts. He says it'll generate $150 million. What are your thoughts on this? Is this the best way to address this issue?
Well, I don't think more gambling is the way to go. As you know, we passed about 5 authorizations for full-fledged casinos. That was a wrong thing to do. It was a wrong thing to do for working families. It's the wrong way to balance your budget. So I was very much opposed to all those bills. The machines you're talking about are called gray machines, or sometimes called games of skill. In fact, they are very, very akin to a slot machine. They're popping up all over because there's a quirk in our law that allowed them to do that. I was supportive of legislation that would outlaw those machines. To be very clear, there's not $150 million you pick up by allowing those machines to go forward. You basically go from one pocket to the other, because right now what we pick up in our lottery and other funding that we currently do is basically dollar for dollar offset by those machines. So I'm very much in favor of what we put into the Senate budget. That is that we outlaw these machines, that they are not regulated today. There's no ability to know whether it's a game of skill, what your chances of winning are. In general, I'm very much opposed to it, and I've seen it in my area of Lynchburg, and they've proliferated all over. So I plan to vote against the governor's amendments. I don't believe it'll be a dollar for dollar grant gain of any money, much less $150 million.
Great. Well, this time the governor has issued some executive orders related to COVID-19. Do you have any concerns? What are your thoughts about these executive orders? And let me just say I apologize for these questions related to COVID-19, but I can tell you it's on the thoughts and minds of so many Virginians, and I know that those are on this call too. So we'd just like to get your thoughts about these executive orders.
Well, it's a good question, and if you get a chance to go to my Facebook page, we've talked a lot about it, and we've tried to talk logically. We appreciate the fact that the governor wants to. His heart is to keep us safe. We appreciate the fact that we need to keep our seniors safe. We need to use personal protective equipment. In my business here, generally we wear masks. We come in with forehead temperature, and we make sure that those people that are at risk work from home. So we hope that everyone out there will remain safe. It's a time that the disease is serious for a certain part of the population, and we want you to be safe. However, when it comes to the orders, what we've seen is really governance, not by laws, but by press conference. And so originally we told the governor, please, before you go make a press conference, write out what it means. And so we were going back with the governor's office over and over again, getting clarification on what things meant. And so we struggled with that. As you'll see from our Facebook post, we struggled a lot with the fact that the governor over and over again thought it was necessary to be very clear that they didn't want you to go to church. In other words, it was not just social distance. At first, there was not even an allowance that you could go to church in a drive-in setting. It just seemed punitive to churches on what they could do. So we got clarification from the governor again. The problem we have now is that at some point we've got to go back to work. But when we do it, we've got to do it safely. We have put out some of our most recent posts have been about this. We don't need binary small thinking right now. We need leadership and we need complex thinking. And I'll give you a great example. The governor has picked out hairstylists and salons and that type of thing. We've said, listen, if you can go to a doctor's office or a veterinarian and you can wear protective devices and they can come in one at a time and we can do that correctly. It's complex thinking. It's not binary, but if you do it correctly, we can do this right. And we think that's true also for our hospitals. If you go to the hospital not far from me or in Southwest Virginia or in Roanoke and other areas, you'll find that they are laying off nurses and doctors right now. Well, we shouldn't be doing that. That's the only government could think of doing that right now. We need to have alternative surgeries going on right now. We need to do it with proper PPEs. We need to do it in a way that's logical and safe, and they will. But this idea that you can have a governor by press conference set out simple-minded thinking has got to end. And that's the other reason, Todd, where I've said that I think the legislature needs to go back in session. There needs to be actual proper collaboration with Republicans, Democrats, everyone during this time. I noticed the governor was asked during his last press conferences, are you talking with Republican leaders as you're going through this process? And the answer was yes, but basically, yes, I've got an open door policy. There's been no collaboration whatsoever coming from the governor's office. We've now sent 3 letters asking him to clarify and give better definitions of how we open and other things. No response on those. We really need this to be a bipartisan approach to keep us safe, but also find a way to allow commerce to continue.
Great response. Along the same lines, and you started to kind of touch on it, the governor has determined that abortion is an essential service during the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course does not respect life. And there are also other concerns about respect for life at the other end of the spectrum, including healthcare decisions based on age and physical or mental abilities. Are you aware of whether there is anything currently being done to ensure everyone receives the proper medical care? And what should Virginia's position or posture be on this topic?
Well, you know, we should always be supportive of life, and that shouldn't be a Republican thing or a Democrat thing. I remember when I passed the partial birth abortion law, I did it with Louise Lucas. She's probably one of the most liberal senators at the state capitol, and we've tried to do these things in a bipartisan way because life should be an item that isn't really partisan. I was very concerned about as much as the governor honestly leaned in as it related to churches should not be open, he leaned in further to make it very clear that there will be elective abortions at any time, at any location. And now there's pressing that Victoria very eloquently laid out on a way to do it more electronically. I know this governor is very committed to the pro-choice movement. I know he and his family have made that abundantly clear. This is the first year at his request. We've actually had the opportunity in state law for a non-physician to perform abortions. Just unbelievable that we would go that far because basically it saved the abortionist more money. And then we are making sure that really that is the only elective surgery that can be done right now. And it happens to be the only one that I know of that takes life, not preserves life. So I'm very concerned about this. We've talked more about that also on our Facebook and other locations. And it's something that is very, very concerning. And unfortunately, we're in a position today, if we don't go into special session, that the only thing we have left is the governor's amendments to bills and the amendments to the budget. So we can't get to those fundamental questions without going into special session. And that's what I hope we would do.
All right, so final question I have. If you could pick one area, whether it's, we're looking at pre-K education, healthcare, cost of living, parental rights, that you believe will be dramatically different for families as a result of this year's session, what do you think it is?
Well, let me answer, maybe if you don't mind, in 2 parts. First, the most dramatic impact has got to be what they're calling the Anti-Discrimination Bills, because I believe that they are targeting churches and synagogues and others to have to fall in line to either make a determination that they're going to give up their faith or they're going to give up their ability to employ individuals. And that's just fundamentally wrong. When you look at what's happened in Canada and other areas, it started the same way. They know exactly what they're doing. So very concerning there. Let me give you another one that this year and last year, I know the Family Foundation and Josh and others have been working on. We're very grateful for it. I'm very, very concerned about this notion that they're now telling Christian counselors, and get this, Christian counselors, that you cannot be a Christian counselor and provide advice that is in line with your Christian faith. In other words, if you think as regards to, for instance, the gay issue, that there's another pathway. If you do that, they're going to take away your professional license. That really puts us as Christians at a crossroads. Are we going to be Christian with our faith? Are we going to follow basically what is hundreds of years of tradition of having religious freedom in the First Amendment? Or are we going to give up on that and take a professional license? I think this is something that we've got to fight. It is the beginning of what I think could be really an intrusion into our religious life, our family decisions that we're making. So I think that one is one that is really on the cusp of being very dangerous. I think this session, what they're calling the Anti-Discrimination Bills, could be very injurious to our families and our businesses going forward.
Yeah, I think you have touched on an issue that so many of the Family Foundation followers and supporters have been really engaged in and very concerned about. It's a concern of ours, and we're going to continue to follow this issue and do what we can on our end. That kind of wraps up my questions, but I do have some questions from some of those that have been on the call and some that have already actually been submitted already that I'd like to try and ask you if time permits. For those that are on the call, you have the ability to ask a question using the question tool that's in your toolbar. But this year, so let me ask you the first question. How can we protect our rights to homeschooling using the religious exemption and an extension of that, protecting our rights to being exempt from immunizations during 2021?
Well, that's a great question. When it comes to homeschoolers, I think we certainly were able to dodge a bullet. For a long time, there were a couple of my dear friends that were Democrats that were very much pro homeschooler. You remember Senator Houck that Victoria and I worked with, and Chuck Colgan and others that were just great Democrats that understood the importance of homeschooling. For the last few years, we've strengthened homeschooling laws and made sure that is certainly well available. This year, we did not have a bill that put that directly on the test this year in the state Senate. We do have a couple of members, Senator Peterson and others, that have been willing to listen on some of those bills. So we're hopeful that our rights as it relates to homeschooling will be preserved. When it comes to immunization and vaccinations, my family's vaccinated. I'll make no mistake about it. I thought it was the right thing to do. My wife Kim and I decided it's the right thing to do. Others have, and then others have what is called a religious exemption. We have protected that religious exemption for many years, and also for someone who may have an allergic reaction and otherwise the ability to forego those based on those two items. This year, there was a press, as you know, to pass a bill that would basically say whatever the CDC puts into the list of vaccinations that are required, that they automatically become part of the code. In recent years, we've always had a vote on those because we've seen in one vaccination that it wasn't a disease that spread through air or other items. It was a disease that was spread through other contact, and that we were concerned that they were starting to add more and more, and some of the drug companies were getting more and more power. And before you know it, we could have beyond the limit we have now, many. So I put an amendment on the floor of the floor of the Senate that was successful that said, yeah, you have to bring all these new ones back to us. That actually passed by a very narrow margin. After that, another Democrat senator added another amendment that said basically that you would not have to do that it would come through a state agency, not through the General Assembly. That was a little unfortunate. So it's something we're going to have to really watch. If we end up seeing now that there are the drug companies and others that are adding more and more of these, or we have other links out there, we need to make sure that we have the ability to have the religious exemption than some of the other exemptions that are currently in the Code of Virginia.
Okay, great. And we do have a lot of our followers are engaged in the homeschooling or homeschool families. So these are really important issues for them as we move forward. Along the same lines in terms of education, there was a major overhaul of pre-K education this year, childhood care and education. What impact will this legislation have, which is aimed at 3- and 4-year-olds, have on private organizations and churches that provide these types of services? Are we going to start to see entities being these private entities being phased out?
Well, it's a great question. And years ago, I think Victoria and I were the only ones that have been around long enough. She was 12 at the time, and I wasn't. But that we fought what was called the Kent Commission, which is basically the desire to have everyone follow the same curriculum, whether you were in a public daycare or a private daycare or religious daycare. It was really kind of getting a monolith out there to where they were being taught that Thanksgiving was a bad thing and all the other politically correct items. This measure basically takes the regulation from where it is today in the Department of Health and moves it to the Department of Education. I voted against that measure. Democrats were very kind to me and to Senator Hanger and others to allow us to make certain amendments to the bill, which I think make it a little better. First, the religious exemption is still in the bill. So there is going to be the regulation that ensures that if someone is going to, for instance, Head Start or something like that, that there's an education component there. The regulation process is pretty rigorous, and that's the reason why I voted against the bill. I think it could be turned at the wrong time against some of the religious institutions and otherwise. I sent my children to Liberty Christian Academy here in Lynchburg to their preschool. It was fantastic for them. I want to make sure we preserve that. So the structure that is there, I think, does preserve more education opportunity within current daycare, but it also is a tool that I fear that one day could be converted into something that could be taken towards some of the religious and other exemptions that now exist.
Great. Let's see. If we can go back to Senate Bill 868 for the non-discrimination bill, you know, the governor, so he's passed it without any sort of amendments, real amendments that protect these religious organizations and churches. Are churches and religious schools going to be considered as places of public accommodations, and where do you think we're going to go from here in finding more about that particular question?
You know, it's sad to say that I think your question is going to be answered in the courts. There is a provision that Chap Peterson and some of us looked at. I fell solidly on the side that it is not strong enough. And Chap, who is concerned about these things, to his credit, he fell on the side that it was. I do not believe there are clear exceptions for religious institutions or for someone that is running a business and decides that they want to perform it in a certain way. So the public accommodation section in particular, I think, is of some concern. Be sure that the amendments that we put forward ensured that the items related to race and creed and all the other things were totally protected. So there was some push out there by some of the left that said, well, if you give an exemption, you're now going to allow exemption for race and other items. Just not true. Our amendments that we wrote were very, very, very clear that it related to activity related to homosexuality. And if you had a concern, a religious concern, then you could choose your own path as it related to that. But I think your question, sadly, because it was not answered on the floor of the Senate or the House, is likely to be one that will be litigated. I think the left will litigate it very hard that we rejected the amendments that would have made it very clear. And I think the right will say that there is a First Amendment right and Virginia Religious Freedom Act that are on the other side.
Yeah, I think we share the same views, and we do have some great religious protections here in Virginia, and those will be tested for sure. I do have one question related, just going back to the issue of conversion, what is often called conversion therapy, or the prohibition against talk therapy. Just essentially, what do you think can be done to, at this point, is this another issue that's going to end up in the courts, or what can be done at this point to try and reverse this path that we're on?
Well, to be clear, because when I was chairman of the Education Committee for years, we killed this bill because we exposed it for what it was. They would come in, some of our friends, my friend Senator Servale would introduce this bill, and he would talk about shock treatment and all these things that were happening, just arcane things that happened. We said, you know, we're all opposed to that. So let's sign up. But every time we said, let's amend the bill to take out all of that information, all that type of behavior, but let's make sure that a professional counselor that's a pastor or otherwise can have a communication with an individual that is in line with their faith. They'd say, no, we don't want that amendment. We don't want to carry that around. So actually, on the floor of the Senate last year, not this year, last year, I carried a bill. I say it'll be my bill. I will make sure we outlaw shock therapy and all these things that are controversial. And that actually passed on the floor of the Senate. There were a couple of people that brought it back, and then it ended up losing by 1 or 2 votes. But to be clear, they've tried to sell this as an item related to just horrible activity that's going on. And we just said we couldn't find it. Number 2, we asked for any examples of where that was occurring. It's just not occurring. So the only thing that they really wanted is what they came after in this bill, which is talk therapy, which basically is the ability of someone that is a professional counselor, happens to be a follower of Christ, and says, you know, I want to have a conversation with a client that's chose to come to me that leads them in a different path. If you do that today, as prescribed in the bill, you are going to lose your license. And then your question becomes very important, and that is, you're going to have that case that will need to be litigated. I think we'll win that litigation. I think it's a overstep in Virginia and other states, but clearly they are following a single path as it relates to these topics.
Okay, well, I have one final question. I know we're running up on some time, and then I want to give you just an opportunity to provide any final comments you may have. And this one goes back to the issue of COVID-19 and really just how should Virginia approach easing some of these restrictions on our economy and way of life while still balancing the ongoing concerns of COVID-19. I know that you've kind of addressed that a little bit, but if there's anything else you wanted to add to this question.
Well, your question is the right one, and I believe that just because some of us are conservatives, some of us are Christians, doesn't mean we aren't capable of very complex thought, and I think we can do that here. And I wish that the governor had reached out to us, because I think what we need to do is we need to put out guidelines that basically have a pathway for reopening safely. And I mentioned the case as it relates to barbershops and salons, and also as it relates to issues in regards to surgery and that type of thing. But we can do that everywhere. We can have complex thinking and still be in government. We can have the ability to actually go out and solve problems and not come out with another edict and another delay. Instead, let's say, hey, what will work? How can we do this safely? How can we protect Virginians, but also send them back to work? Work is valuable. It really is valuable. We have been very fortunate in this building here because we were deemed to be essential because of where we are. But there's a lot of Virginians that are struggling right now, and government can't take care of them, and they don't want to be taken care of by government. We need to make sure that we find a way, in an intelligent way, with complex leadership, telling them how you can perform this particular task and how you can do it safely. I think that would be seen by Virginians as leadership.
Great. I think that's a great way to end those questions. Just want to give you an opportunity for final thoughts coming up. You have reconvene session coming up next week, and you'll be in a different setting. Maybe you could let folks know how they can, if they can watch. Is it going to be televised? Just kind of give them a feel for what to expect next week, and then any final thoughts you may have about this particular session.
Well, great. First, thank you, and Victoria and your entire team. Thank you for not only today, but thank you for what you do day in and day out. Most people will never know the work that your team is doing there in defending our basic rights and our families. Yes, we will go back into session on Wednesday. We will do it from the Science Museum of Virginia. We will do it hopefully in one day. I'm not in favor of having any remote voting or any of that type of thing. I know the speaker has mentioned that. I think you lose too much that way. So we'll be there. I think you will be able to view what occurs there. There'll be a lot of good debate. We're going to talk about how we reopen. We're going to talk about engaging with a session where we can actually be partners with the governor, be consulted when it comes to some of these items that are important. So thank you for the opportunity. Nice to see all of you here. Wish you all that you will be safe, and we wish you well.
All right. Well, thank you, Senator Newman. We're really appreciative of your work and your leadership. And I do encourage everyone, Senator Newman is not my senator, but I certainly follow his Facebook page because I get great information from what he puts out. It helps to, always have good connections with folks that think and believe the way we do and provide leadership for our Commonwealth in that direction. So really encourage you to do that. And it isn't that we just love our Lynchburg legislators, but on that note, we are excited that Kathy Byron is going to be our speaker next week. It's not just that we love Lynchburg, but again, we get great leadership both on the House and the Senate side. You can see my dog is trying to make an entrance here to this teleconference. But anyway, so next week at this time at lunchtime, we'll be having Delegate Byron to share some House perspective. This will be critical. This will be just one day after this veto session that we're talking about, this reconvened session. So we'll get kind of the follow-up to this conversation is as to what actually happened that day, what decisions were made. Are we going to have some kind of special session? So we're looking forward to some of those answers and hearing some of that debate. And so the other thing I encourage folks, if for some reason you are not already on our Family Foundation email list, you really want to be on that. That's the other way you stay engaged and informed about these issues. We had a petition effort last week. Thank you to those of you that jumped on and signed that petition after the call. Again, that was trying to do that last push to the governor. We feel we've done everything we could. And that's really how we have to posture ourselves in a situation where we're not always in alignment with our leadership. We just have to do everything we can to advance the cause and the issues, and hope that they get, that they get enough pressure, that they get enough insight to actually come join us. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't, but it doesn't mean we don't stay active. It's a marathon, it's not a sprint. It's not, you win some, you lose some. And unfortunately, you have to litigate some. That's sort of the next piece of certainly the talk therapy that Senator Newman was speaking of is absolutely expected to be litigation. We've already seen hints from the U.S. Supreme Court that that's not going to be considered legitimate. And so we're just kind of waiting till these cases work their way up. Whether Virginia will be one of those, there are some states in front of us, but I'm not so sure that we won't be right on that same chain with a case coming right out of the Commonwealth here. So with that, appreciate those of you that realize this is a new platform. Last week we had a different platform. We just have concerns about the numbers exceeding our ability to host them on the previous platform. So hopefully this worked well for you and you're able to get your questions in the chat box. If you do have any questions for us, feel free to hit us up by our website or our email addresses that are located there, and we can smooth any details that you had with this webinar. So until next week, thanks so much for being part of the Family Foundation.